Welcome to the Joints of the Skeletal System PowerPoint. Please follow along with your assigned note sheet and please write down 2 to 3 questions that you still have based on this PowerPoint, and please bring them to the class for the next class session. There are over 230 movable or partially movable joints in the body. A joint, otherwise known as an articulation, is a place where two bones meet. Joints enable a wide variety of body movements. They're going to bind parts of the skeletal system. They allow bone growth, permit bones to change shape during childbirth. If you remember from the skeletal system, one of the joints that change during the shape of the childbirth is the pubis symphysis. Remember, that can open up about 1 centimeter during childbirth. They enable the body to respond to skeletal muscle contractions to allow movement. Joints are classified by the type of movement or also what binds them together. The 3 types of classifications are fibrous connective tissue, cartilage, and a synovial type of joint. We will talk about each one of these during the PowerPoint. Like I said in the previous slide, joints can also be grouped according to how much movement, if at all, they allow the bones to move. For example, synarthrotic means that they are immovable or incapable of producing any movement. Amphiarthrotic means that they are slightly movable, so some movement, much like the symphysis pubis that can move up to 1 centimeter during childbirth, would be considered as amphiarthrotic. And then a diarthrotic is a freely movable joint. These are things like your knee, your shoulder, your hip, to be exact. This just shows you the different types of movable joints or immovable joints. So right here we have a suture, and those are immovable joints. At the elbow, these are synovial joints, and this is a hinge joint. So this is going to be pretty much freely movable. You have your cartilaginous joints in the vertebrae, and then the ribs in the vertebrae. These are semi-movable, and the cartilaginous joints right here are semi-movable. And then down here, the hip is a ball and socket, which is also a diarthrotic. So the first one that we're going to talk about is a synarthrotic, or an immovable joint. This is connected via dense connective tissue. Next is the amphiarthrotic, or slightly movable. These are things like your symphysis pubis or the intervertebral discs, as well as, you can see right here, this is the joint between the tibia and the fibula. It's not really going to move much, but it can move a little bit. And lastly, we have the diarthrotic, which are your shoulder joint, which is right here, or your knee joint. They tend to move in all different planes. Next, we're going to go based on the types of joints. First up is the fibrous joints. These are going to be connected via dense connective tissue and between bones in close contact. As a rule of thumb, the fibrous joints do not produce much movement. Now, in fibrous joints, there are 3 specific types. There's something called a syndesmosis. An example of this is the distal end of the tibia and the fibula. So, like I said here, these are not going to produce much movement. It could move slightly, but it's not going to be able to move in all planes like a diarthrotic. Then you have a suture, which we learned about in the skull. That's basically where 2 bones have actually fused together. And then a gomphosis is a tooth. Once again, your teeth don't move. So that is going to be a immovable joint. Syndesmosis is a joint bound by a ligament. Like I said before, it permits a slight movement. And the main one that we can use here is the distal end of the tibia and the fibula. You can also use the radius and the ulna as an example. This again is the amphiarthrotic, which is slight movement. Sutures, like I said before, most often are going to be found between the flat bones of the skull. They also have something called fontanelles. Fontanelles, as if you remember from the skeletal system chapter, are basically membrane areas that are going to be found in the baby's skull. The reason for these is that as the baby comes through the birth canal, the fontanelles allow the skull to basically mold to the shape of the birth canal and allow the baby to be born. As an adult, as a child grows up, they are going to then produce more bone there, and the fontanelles will actually allow the bones of the skull right here and right here to fuse back together. So the suture is basically where those two bones that used to possibly be a fontanelle have now grown together. As adults, like I said before, sutures close and interlock. If you remember from the skeletal system chapter, you have four major sutures in the skull. You have the squamous suture, which is between the temporal bone and the parietal bones. You have the coronal suture, which separates the frontal bones from the parietal bones. The sagittal, which joins the two parietal, and then the lambdoidal, which is the occipital with the parietal and the temporal. These are immovable joints. They are not going to move at all. Okay, lastly, we have gomphosis. A gomphosis is a cone-shaped bone in a bony socket. So here you have your tooth. Okay, here's your gum line. And then all of this down here is actually the mandible or the bone. Now granted, remember that it could be the maxilla as well. Now what happens is this is a socket that's actually going to hold this tooth in place. There is a nerve root here, and then that nerve root is actually going to have a ligament that's going to wrap around the root to hold it in place. This is an immovable joint. So obviously your teeth are not going to move. We've come to the end of the fibrous joints, so I want to remind you that there are 3 different subcategories of this. It's a syndesmosis is one, a suture is a second, and a gomphosis is a third. Among these, you have either an amphiarthrotic movement or a synarthrotic, meaning that it is immovable. Okay? Next, we have cartilaginous joints. There are 2 subtypes here. This first type is the synchondrosis, which it will usually disappear, and we will talk about a little bit more in depth. Next, you have your symphysis, which is going to hold 2 bones together with cartilage. So the first synchondrosis is basically like the epiphyseal disc that we've talked about during the first part of the skeletal system. This is a band of hyaline cartilage that is going to unite bones. So you can see here as the bone is growing, you have this new cartilage disc that is going to spur new bone cells into place, and it's going to allow the bone to grow in length. As you grow, we know that the bones, that band of cartilage is going to slightly disappear once we have reached our full growth. That epiphyseal disc then is going to cease to exist, and we call this ossification. This is not movable. This is something called a synarthrotic joint. The next type in the cartilaginous joints is a symphysis. These are bones that are covered by a thin layer of hyaline cartilage with fibrocartilage in between. This is an example of the symphysis pubis, which is right here. Remember, that's going to join the 2 pubic bones. Remember, that's slightly movable. And then you have the intervertebral discs that are going to sit between the two bodies of the vertebrae. Once again, both of these are semi-movable. Lastly, we have synovial joints. Synovial joints are going to be freely movable, but they're also going to have the most numerous of all the joints. They have articular cartilage, a joint capsule, and a synovial membrane. This just shows you basically what goes into making a synovial joint. We're going to talk about bursa, which is a fluid-filled sac. We're going to talk about the articular cartilage, which is right here, and then we're also going to talk about the joint capsule, which has 2 layers. So first up is the articular cartilage. Remember that at the ends of the bones, or the epiphyses, you have this shiny cartilage that is going to allow the bones to basically move freely over each other. It's going to reduce friction and resist wear. When you age, this is actually going to kind of wear away, and it can kind of fray over time. I don't know if I ever told you guys, but when I was a senior in high school, I had a knee injury, and they went in and they actually scoped underneath my knee. So all this cartilage was kind of basically frayed, and what they did is they went in and just cut it and made it nice and smooth. Over time, your body should be able to basically repair that. If your genetics give you a slower process of repairing that, that could lead to some arthritis. It is possible to completely wear away this articular cartilage. My mom actually had no articular cartilage on the ends of her bones, and it was basically just bone on bone. So that leads to people having total knees and other things that we'll talk about later. Okay, the next thing is joint capsule. You have 2 layers of the joint capsule. You have an outer layer, which is going to be fibrous connective tissue. It's going to connect to the periosteum, which is the membrane around the bone, and it's going to totally enclose the joint. The inner layer then is a synovial membrane. Okay, it's going to be a shiny vascular tissue, and it's going to have this lubricating fluid that helps make the joint move easily and also cut down on friction. Okay. And then lastly, you're going to have the menisci. These are basically half-moon shaped fibrocartilages that are going to be on either side of the knee. So let's just talk about this. This is the top of your tibia. Okay, this is the front of the knee right here. And then you have your lateral meniscus, which is obviously going to be on the lateral side, and you have your medial meniscus. Now you can tear this, and it can be pretty painful. Your body will repair that, but sometimes they have to go in and actually repair the cut or whatever was torn. And the main part of this is that it's going to cushion the joint. Okay. Okay. Next are bursae. They're fluid-filled sacs and joints. So you can see here that there are different bursae all over the knee. Okay. Basically what they're going to do is they're going to contain synovial fluid, and they're going to cushion and helps the movement of the tendons. Now what can happen is if these get inflamed, it's called bursitis, and that can be very, very painful. One of the main points for bursitis is actually in the hip. Next we have kinds of synovial joints. So the first one is a ball and socket. This is movement in all planes, meaning that you don't just have limited movement like up and down. It means you can move it from side to side and a rotational movement. Some of these are going to be hip and also the shoulder. Okay, next up is the condyloid joint. These have no rotational movement, meaning that you can't rotate them. However, you can move them front to back or side to side. These would be between the radius and the ulna. Between the radius and some of your carpals, like the scaphoid and the lunate. So if you move your wrist back and forth or side to side, that would be an example of a condyloid joint. Okay, it can also be between the metacarpals and the phalanges, and just know that it's no rotational movement. It's just front and back or side to side. Next is a gliding joint. These are usually between flat or slightly curved bones. It's going to have a sliding motion, and most often it's going to be between the carpal bones or the tarsal bones. Like I said, there's not going to be a whole heck of a lot of movement. It's going to be usually in one plane, and they are going to be usually between the carpal and the tarsal bones. Next we have the hinge joint. It's a concave surface that fits into a convex surface. What that means is that there's one plane of movement and it's going to hinge at a certain point. So the example here is going to be your knee, your elbows, or your fingers that basically go up and down. A pivot joint is one bone that is going to rotate around another. So it does have some rotational movement. The examples of these are obviously your atlas and your axis. So remember that the atlas sits on top of the axis and then it's going to rotate around this dens. That it means that it allows you to turn your head. Another one is going to be if you can move your forearm and rotate it that way. That's going to be where the head of the radius and the ulna actually move around each other. Okay, lastly, the last type of synovial joint, okay, is a saddle joint. This comes with a variety of movements. You can see here in this diagram, you can move it front to back or side to side. The examples of this type of joint is between a carpal and a metacarpal. So let's take a look right here at the thumb. Okay, this is the trapezium, and then here is your first metacarpal. If you can rotate your thumb, that's basically how you are moving that saddle joint. Okay, you're rotating it, or you're moving it back and forth. So that would be an example of a saddle joint. Okay, that's the end of the PowerPoint. What I want you guys to come away with is that there are two ways that you can classify joints. You can classify them based on what binds them. Remember that you have your fibrous joints, your synovial joints, and your cartilaginous joints, which also have subdivisions. And then you have based on movement. So you have your diarthritic, your amphiarthrotic, and then your synarthrotic. And then each of the joints, like I said, based on what binds them, is going to have different subdivisions. So, like I said, please come to class with 2 questions that we can go over them and be prepared to add to the discussion. Okay, thanks for watching.